The jet cabin was bathed in mid-morning light, engines promising stability. The gate atmosphere was frantic. The boarding door was sealing, and only one vacant seat remained. Ethan, a single dad, hurried aboard, breathless, accepting the last seat. Annoyed passengers shot him impatient glances. In the front, Vivian, a billionaire CEO, glanced back, her half-smile dripping disdain. "Last seat confirmed," the attendant stated. The plane began to taxi. An incredibly subtle, unusual tremor vibrated through the floor, a soft, unsettling rhythm. A pilot light flickered briefly. The cabin chime rang. The captain's voice, slow and grave, came over the intercom. The air instantly turned to ice. Ethan was the picture of the typical economy traveler. Faded t-shirt, worn jeans, and an urgency that spoke of necessity, not luxury. He was a single father flying cross-country after a last-minute custody issue, his hurried travel plans forcing him into the least desirable seat on the plane, 30F, the final row, right by the rear galley and the constant bustle of the flight attendants. This sudden, urgent trip was necessitated by an unexpected medical emergency involving his ex-wife, requiring him to take immediate temporary custody of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. He needed to be there. Money was tight, time was tighter, and his focus was razor-sharp, aimed only at reuniting with his child. He quickly settled in, immediately putting on worn, noise-canceling headphones, a clear sign of his desire to retreat. He wanted zero interaction, just the quiet passage of time until he could see his daughter. He was a man focused solely on the destination, not the journey. His appearance was deliberate, a shield. He cultivated an aura of simple invisibility. Up front, in the opulent quiet of first class, sat Vivian Thorne. She was a titan of tech investment, known for her sharp intelligence and her even sharper impatience. She was on her way to close a 9-figure deal, and every second was a quantified metric of her professional worth. Vivian was accustomed to priority boarding, private lounges, and the silent respect that came with her wealth and power. Ethan's late arrival, the very reason the jet had almost missed its slot, had been a minor irritation, a smudge on her otherwise perfectly planned morning. She frowned slightly at the back of the cabin, the simple act of his tardiness registering as a sign of general inefficiency and lack of professional drive. She muttered softly to her assistant, "The last seat on the plane always means someone else's lack of planning, doesn't it? That kind of chaos shouldn't be allowed near a schedule like mine." No one in the cabin, least of all Vivian, imagined these two radically different people would ever intersect. Their worlds were too far apart, separated by a thin, invisible curtain of class and capital. As the plane taxied, Ethan didn't scroll through his phone or watch a movie. Instead, his eyes performed an unconscious, habitual sweep of the cabin, checking exit signs, assessing the mood of the crew, and noting the position of the emergency equipment. It was a leftover reflex from a previous life, a career that demanded constant, high-stakes situational awareness. His past. Ethan wasn't just familiar with high-altitude transport systems. He was once an elite, certified flight systems integrity auditor and a former Air Force tactical transport specialist. He had spent his 20s managing complex, heavy-lift logistical airframes, dealing with system failures where the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second and the cargo often involved lives. He was forced out of that life by a horrific incident involving a preventable mechanical failure that led to a loss of life, a failure that was ultimately blamed on a junior officer protecting a powerful defense contractor. Ethan took the fall for his integrity, refusing to sign a cover-up report. He chose to leave the entire industry, sacrificing his high-security clearance and vast professional network to become a nobody, a single father earning a fraction of his former salary, seeking only quiet stability away from the dangerous compromises of power. Though he was dressed as a common passenger, his mind was operating like a systems auditor, perpetually monitoring the machine around him. He closed his eyes, and that was when he first felt it, the slight, deep vibration through the floor under his worn sneakers. It was subtly irregular, a hiccup in the otherwise steady, powerful rumble of the aircraft's systems. The kind of physical dissonance that digital diagnostics were often programmed to filter out as ambient noise, an environmental anomaly that could be ignored. His past life had taught him that the machine never lies, it only whispers. The physical sensation was the truth. The digital readout was just a highly filtered interpretation of it. The unusual tremor occurred again, a near imperceptible pulse against the metal. Ethan instinctively counted the rhythm. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. His internal clock measured the exact interval of the slight displacement. 3.7 seconds. This was a non-random, cyclical event, the hallmark of a mechanical or electronic feedback loop gone wrong. This was the mark of a true operator. Physical sensation first, technical confirmation second. Inside the flight deck, the captain and first officer exchanged an uneasy look. The primary sensor readings were normal, but a transient fault light had flashed on the secondary display, disappearing immediately. The first officer calmly announced over the intercom, "Folks, just a small bit of turbulence on the ground. We'll be airborne shortly." A passenger nearby laughed and joked about a bad suspension. The flight, to all appearances, was completely normal, but Ethan, in his solitude at the back of the plane, knew better. The whisper was persistent, and its cycle was terrifyingly regular. 30 minutes into the flight, sailing smoothly above a blanket of white clouds, the problem was no longer a whisper. It was a noticeable, grinding thump, a physical sound that resonated through the cabin every 3.7 seconds. The initial tremor had been a warning. This was an established, escalating event. On the flight deck, the technical situation had become a dangerous paradox. The three primary sensor arrays, the Air Data Computer, ADC, the Main Inertial Reference System, IRS, and the Primary Angle of Attack, AOA indicator, all stubbornly reported a stable, optimal flight path, green and perfect. But the secondary backup system, a series of independently powered microsensors, now flashing steadily, insisted on reporting critical, intermittent instability, specifically a phantom loss of lift and an unauthorized surface deployment. A stall warning, but with perfect velocity. Standard operating procedures were instantly deadlocked. The checklist had no response for a situation where half the instruments demanded an immediate turnback and emergency descent, while the other half reported perfect sailing. The captain knew he couldn't trust the warning because the plane felt perfectly stable. But he couldn't ignore it either. He was trapped in a digital stalemate, his training failing because the reality was split. The cabin crew, trained for smooth service, struggled desperately to maintain the illusion of calm. Their forced smiles became fixed, their movements slightly too quick as they rattled beverage carts down the aisles. The head flight attendant, Maria, kept her eyes rigidly forward, the sheen of sweat on her temple betraying her carefully constructed facade. They were essentially lying to the passengers with every reassurance. Vivian up front finally tore off her noise-canceling headphones, her irritation giving way to a cold, professional dread. This was no longer bad service. This was inefficiency touching her life. She was accustomed to controlling every variable, and the one thing she could never purchase or dictate was physical safety midair. Her sharp eyes scanned the faces of the flight attendants. "What in the world is that grinding noise?" she demanded sharply to her assistant, her voice stripped of its usual commanding warmth. "Find out what they're hiding. I want to know exactly what system is malfunctioning." Then the inevitable happened. The plane gave a sudden, sharp, deep lurch to the left, a vertical drop of maybe 20 feet that proved the secondary systems were terrifyingly right. The overhead luggage compartments rattled violently. The cabin went silent, except for the sudden, shallow breathing of dozens of people. A middle-aged man in business class panicked, attempting to stand up and shout before being gently but firmly guided back down by a flight attendant. The panic was now visible, tangible, and spreading like a virus. The captain's voice returned over the loudspeaker. His tone was technically calm but dangerously strained, the sound of a man fighting 2 decades of experience with a console full of lies. "We are experiencing a minor, unconfirmed instrument discrepancy, which caused a momentary oscillation. We are following safety protocols. Please remain seated." He was trying to sound confident, but his voice broke slightly on the word oscillation. The underlying tension was palpable. Every eye in the cabin began searching, not for the pilot but for certainty, for a figure of authority. At the very back, Ethan slowly lowered his headphones and gripped the worn plastic armrest. His focus narrowed completely. The rhythmic thump, which the pilot had dismissed as discrepancy and oscillation, was now occurring with greater severity and terrifying predictability. The 3.7-second interval was holding fast. He wasn't looking at the ceiling or the seats. He was concentrating on the subtle vibration patterns through the metal floor and the back wall, listening to the machine's heartbeat. He identified it. The precise frequency of the vibration matched that of a catastrophic control surface flutter caused by incorrect trim compensation. It was the precise frequency of a false stall pattern. The aircraft was being instructed by a flawed feedback loop, driven by a single corrupted sensor, to correct a problem that wasn't there, pushing the controls in a cyclical, dangerous compensation that was now creating actual momentary loss of lift. He knew exactly what was happening. One corrupted sensor was forcing the primary flight controls into an escalating, self-perpetuating, destabilizing dance. The more the aircraft corrected, the worse the problem became. They were flying on the brink, and the pilots were treating the consequence as the cause. No one in the cabin, not even the highly experienced pilots relying on the primary digital readout, had the context or the detachment to understand the truth. They were being flown by a ghost in the machine. They were seconds away from escalating the problem with an unnecessary dangerous maneuver based on the faulty digital data, an emergency descent that would overstress the airframe. He stood up slowly, deliberately, a single man in an economy seat, utterly alone in his knowledge, moving toward the frantic knot of flight attendants near the galley. This was the terrifying moment before the total, irreversible loss of control. He had to speak. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, how one man's forgotten expertise and quiet conviction pierce through chaos to save everyone, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The plane lurched violently again, not just dipping, but shuddering, a bone-jarring, stomach-turning snap that sent a wave of choked screams through the cabin. The secondary warning lights in the cockpit began to flash violently. The captain was already reaching for the radio to declare a full-scale, life-threatening emergency, preparing the cabin for a high-speed structural integrity testing descent. Ethan moved with the sudden, controlled urgency of a man who had seen this scenario play out in slow motion before. He ignored the terrified gasps of the surrounding passengers and approached the galley, his voice calm, clear, and cutting through the mounting noise. He spoke directly to Maria, the head flight attendant, not with panic but with professional clinical authority, the voice of a system administrator on a failing network. I need to speak to the captain immediately. Tell him I have a specific diagnosis for the unconfirmed discrepancy. Tell him it's a corrupted trim sensor forcing a continuous, incorrect compensatory cycle. It's the yaw damper being fed bad data from a single angle of attack input. He needs to manually damp the pitch input and disable the feedback loop before it initiates a full stall protection sequence. Maria, the flight attendant, froze. The precise, devastatingly accurate technical language coming from seat 30F, the last seat, was a total shock. But the next thump was harder, more violent, silencing all doubt. She spoke quickly into the internal phone, her hands trembling, relaying the exact, strange, life-or-death message. Moments later, the reinforced cockpit door opened. Not fully, but enough for the captain, his face grim and drenched in sweat, to peer out. He expected an air marshal or perhaps an off-duty pilot in a uniform. Instead, he saw Ethan, dressed simply, standing by a galley cart. "Who are you? Are you rated? We are declaring an emergency," the captain barked, desperation replacing protocol. Ethan was brutally brief, his eyes locked on the captain's. "I am not current, but I have thousands of hours on high-altitude transport systems. My rating is secondary to the immediate threat. Sir, your primary instruments are lying to you. Do not touch the trim or the primary pitch controls. Just tell me, what is your current indicated airspeed and pitch?" The captain, a man whose life was dictated by numbers, was startled by the correct terminology, the high-level assessment, and the sheer confidence. He had nothing to lose. He gave the numbers: 340 knots, 1.5 degrees pitch variance. Ethan processed the data in a flash, cross-referencing it with the now violent 3.7-second vibration pattern in his hands. The speed and pitch are fundamentally wrong for the current indicated force feedback. The system is fighting itself. You have a false stall warning being generated by an input device, not aerodynamic failure. The faulty AOA vane is generating a ghost signal that the yaw computer is treating as a constant, uncommanded input, forcing a perpetual nose-down compensation. Ethan spoke rapidly, cleanly, cutting through the panic. You need to perform a counterintuitive manual override on the yaw damper only, use maximum counter rudder, then immediately locate and disconnect the entire secondary trim, input power source under the console. It will feel wrong, like you're trying to break the plane, but it will break the loop instantly. Ethan wasn't flying the plane. He was fixing the logic of the flight. The captain, a veteran of 2 decades who had specialized in avionics system debugging, recognized the diagnosis instantly. It was an arcane, ultra-rare system failure, a catastrophic digital infection that only someone who had spent thousands of hours in the flight simulation core or the high-pressure field would know. With the aircraft dropping rapidly, there was no time for pride, for credentials, or for procedure. There was only time for survival. "Do it!" the captain commanded his co-pilot, his voice sharp with finality, relaying the instruction exactly as the man in the aisle had given it. He was betting the lives of everyone on the plane on the certainty in the eyes of a stranger. The co-pilot executed the sequence, the manual opposite direction yaw movement, followed by the power cut to the auxiliary sensor cluster. For a gut-wrenching second, a full 3 beats, the plane felt like it was going to tear itself apart, the yaw damper fighting the manual command before the power was cut. Then with a definitive thunk that replaced the rhythmic grinding, the aircraft snapped back to perfect, stable, level flight. The terrifying rhythmic oscillation vanished entirely. The red warning lights on the auxiliary panel immediately winked out, replaced by a solid, reassuring green. The core flight systems were stable. The plane was flying perfectly once more. The cockpit door closed softly, finally blocking out the collective emergency. The silence in the cabin was total, a heavy, profound silence unlike any before. Up in her first-class seat, Vivian Thorne, who had been holding her breath, slowly let it out in a quiet, ragged gasp. She had watched the entire exchange, the simple man from the back seat, the precise technical exchange, the captain's strained compliance, and the instantaneous, undeniable success of the maneuver. Vivian realized with the absolute cold clarity of a multi-million-dollar realization that the single dad who had been an irritation 5 minutes ago was, in fact, the only person on board who truly possessed the necessary high-stakes capability. He hadn't just solved a technical problem, he had saved her life, something all her wealth, all her networking, and all her influence could never have achieved. Her financial models, her stock portfolio, her entire existence had been reliant on the immediate, unrecognized knowledge of the man she had dismissed. She tried to turn to her assistant to demand an immediate investigation into his identity, to offer him a job, a contract, anything that would restore her sense of control. But the words failed her. Her throat felt tight, her tongue thick and frozen. Her authority, her customary contempt for the common man, and her self-assured belief in the hierarchy of prestige had just been shattered by the man in seat 30F. She could not speak. She could only watch the area where he had stood. The billionaire CEO was utterly, completely frozen in her seat, paralyzed not by fear, but by a sudden, devastating humility. All eyes in the cabin, having seen the impossible, now swiveled and locked onto the back of the plane, the last seat, waiting for the quiet hero's return. The silence held for another minute, broken only by the normal, healthy roar of the engines. It was the sound of life, perfect and steady. Then the voice of the first officer returned over the intercom, his tone now noticeably lighter, though still deeply respectful, almost reverent. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for that brief, unscripted delay. We have resolved the discrepancy and are proceeding under standard flight parameters. We expect a smooth journey from here. It was the captain, however, who spoke next, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic, profound weight. He made an announcement that was not in any manual. I want to personally thank a passenger for identifying an extremely rare, intermittent system anomaly, a critical insight that allowed us to quickly stabilize the aircraft. That intervention was outside the operational envelope of our current training. We are safe, thanks to extraordinary measures. He didn't name Ethan. He didn't detail the fix. He simply acknowledged that a situation outside the book had been resolved by a person outside the cockpit. It was a deliberate, respectful cover that gave Ethan his anonymity while giving the crew the operational credit. Ethan, having ensured the system was responding correctly, quietly returned to his seat in the back. He didn't seek applause. He didn't want the spotlight. He placed his worn headphones back over his ears, a signal that the crisis was resolved and his job was done. When Maria, the head flight attendant, discreetly approached him later to ask for his credentials, he offered a brief, humble explanation, a technical summary of the AOA vein input corruption, ensuring the pilots had enough context for their report without compromising his hard-won anonymity. He insisted that the crew take all the credit for the successful stabilization. His past taught him that the best credit was simply seeing his loved ones again. The captain's final, safest decision was to divert to the nearest major airport for a precautionary landing and a complete structural inspection. The announcement was met not with panic, but with a profound, almost reverent obedience. The cabin remained eerily quiet. Passengers who had minutes ago been irritable, demanding, or gossiping now sat in absolute stunned silence. The fear had passed, replaced by a deep, collective awe. Vivian Thorne was no longer the center of attention, nor was she attempting to be. She was simply a witness. For the first time, she was merely one of many, humbled by the close brush with disaster. She kept her gaze fixed on the back of the plane, specifically on the solitary figure in seat 30F, who was now just a man with a duffel bag, listening to music. Her habitual transactional view of people, based entirely on title, rank, and profit, was visibly crumbling. I spent $500,000 on this flight to get to a deal, she thought. And the man who saved that deal in my life was the one I silently mocked for being late. I couldn't buy his competence for any price. It came free, earned through discipline and experience. She saw a man who had chosen to be nobody, yet who possessed a knowledge that outweighed every asset she owned, every contract she signed, and every title she held. The internal order of the cabin had been completely reset. The man in the last seat, who carried no prestige, had become the moral and operational center of the aircraft. He had forced the entire cabin, including the most powerful woman on board, into a deep, silent reflection. The hierarchy of wealth had been temporarily rendered irrelevant by the uncompromising law of physics and skill. 45 minutes later, the diverted plane made a smooth, perfect landing on the runway of a quiet regional airport. The collective sigh of relief in the cabin was almost audible, a soft, nervous sound of survival, now tinged with anticipation. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the passengers, now relieved and buzzing with adrenaline, began to search. Who was the hero? Where was the expert? Eyes scanned the aisles, looking for a crisp uniform, a recognizable figure, or someone basking in the glow of public adoration. But Ethan was simply retrieving his small, worn duffel bag from the overhead compartment. He did not make eye contact. He avoided the growing crowd of curious onlookers. He had already settled back into his chosen role of the quiet, invisible man, his primary goal, getting to his daughter, back in focus. The captain himself, accompanied by the first officer, walked out of the cockpit door. Instead of addressing the crowd, he walked straight past the entire first-class section, ignoring Vivian, and stopped right by seat 30F. The two men, the uniformed captain, officially in command, and the single dad in the worn t-shirt, exchanged a brief, silent, profound handshake. The captain's eyes conveyed a debt that could never be repaid. He simply nodded, a gesture of deep military respect, then turned and walked back into the flight deck to finish his duties. Finally, Vivian Thorne approached. The Queen of Tech, who rarely waited for anyone, stood patiently by the galley until Ethan was ready to step into the aisle. Her usual expression of cold assurance was replaced by a look of genuine, complicated humility. She wasn't offering a job, a contract, or a donation. She knew those things would miss the point entirely. She had already pulled up a full, confidential profile on him through her security contact. She knew his name, his past, and his daughter's situation. She stopped right next to him, allowing the other passengers to shuffle past them in the narrow aisle. She didn't extend her hand. She looked him directly in the eye and spoke the only two words that mattered, her voice barely a whisper in the echoing quiet of the aisle. "Thank you." But then she added one more thing, a direct acknowledgement of his sacrifice. "And Ethan, your daughter is lucky to have a father whose judgment is so sound." Ethan simply met her gaze, offered a respectful small nod, acknowledging the gratitude and the unexpected deeper respect, and walked past her, down the aisle, and off the plane. He had done his duty, and now he was going home to his daughter. He didn't look back. The last seat on the plane, the one everyone dismissed, had anchored the flight, saved everyone, and quietly shifted the moral axis of the entire cabin. It proved that the true measure of a person is never their title, their wealth, or their position, but their quiet, uncompromising capacity to act when everything else fails. If you believe stories like this, where quiet, unassuming capability changes absolutely everything, deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Some moments are quiet, unassuming moments, but they change absolutely everything.